cooking to see if it was really reliable to support the induction cook stoves and other appliances that they use in the slums. Next, please. Yeah, so this is the map of our study area. Madara is located about 1.3 degrees south and 36.9 degrees east. The yellow dots are the households. We did about 242 households interviews in Madare 4A and Utali sublocation. You can see they were well spread across the landscape. Next, please. So our approach we developed was purposive sampling. We did this because we wanted to capture households that are legally connected to electricity and those ones which are not, which are the majority, as you shall see from our study. So we had to use some guidance to know the houses that were really connected to legally and have meters. So we administered semi-structured questionnaires, and a total of 242 households were interviewed. And then we had energy monitoring devices that were installed on main sockets. As you can see, there's a main socket and connected to a meter, and then you connect your load. So the load can be electric kettle or a cooker, whatever it is. But our interest was to know the power supply, what is the voltage supply in real time, and we will present that information. So this meter records the data after 15 minutes interval, but currently we have programmed them to record even at 1 minute interval for our next interviews. Next, please. So generally the demographics of the respondents, we interviewed people above 18 years to over 60. The older population were very few. Most of them were female, and they were the primary cooks in this particular study. Next, please. So maybe our discussion starts from here, that the cooking options we found out in Kibra is that quite a number of different fuels are used. And it is interesting to know that LPG is the dominant fuel in the slum areas. About 53.7% of the households were using them. Kerosene still persists to be one of the common fuels, although it is a modern fuel but polluting. Charcoal is the third dominant fuel used. Ethanol is coming up. It's quite interesting. It's a new fuel in the market at about 16.5%. Electricity usage for cooking is still very low at 6.2%. And briquettes, only one household reported to use briquettes, contrary to what actually I thought initially. So the next slide indicates something interesting here on the fuel stacking. As you can see that although the energy ladder theory that assumes as your income increases, you tend to move to more cleaner fuels, that is not the truth in the slum areas, because quite a number of households are mixing different fuels. However, I singled out some households that were entirely depending on one particular fuel. In this case, we realize that those households that are relying on kerosene only, you can see the bars that are colored orange. I colored them orange. That is the fuels that are entirely relied on. So kerosene happened to be the major fuel that is entirely relied on, followed by gas, and then ethanol and charcoal. I think this is a good trajectory, because if you can have households that are entirely relying on LPG gas and ethanol, that is an indication that we are moving towards completely relying on cleaner fuels. Nevertheless, other fuels still persist, and households tend to mix the different fuels. Go next, please. Then we were also interested to know the different appliances that are used for the different fuels. And for charcoal, for instance, we realized that ordinary jikos, those ones without clay linings, are still the majority. 58 households were using it. That is 24% of the population. And the Kenya ceramic jiko, the one with the clay lining, is also used by about 12% of the population. For the LPG gas, the single burners are still the dominant, what we normally refer to the MECO. They're still dominant because 106 households were using it. That's about 43% of the households. Then the double burner cookers are still low at about 9.9%. For kerosene stove is commonly used. For the ethanols, which are supplied by the cocoa networks, they supply the double cooker burners. It's interesting, about 16.5 using it. For electricity, the slum dwellers, those ones that we found to be using electricity for cooking, are using the generic 4-ring spiral electric coils. I did not see induction cookers, although they were really willing to use it, and I'll explain that later in the next slides. For firewood, they use the stones. It's fine. So we assessed the single payment for the primary fuels. Now that we had known the primary fuels to be kerosene, LPG, ethanol, and charcoal, we had interest to know the cost of those fuels whenever they go to buy them, the single payments. When they go to buy them, how much do they cost? Something we found out and has been reported before also is that because these slum dwellers are daily wage earners, they tend to buy fuels in smaller quantities that resonates with their income. For instance, for the kerosene, you can see they could buy kerosene as low as 15 shillings, and with the majority buying it at 50 shillings on a daily basis. At least they can buy that to use every day because they're daily wage earners. Very few households can afford to buy large quantities of fuel at very higher prices like 1,000 shillings. For the LPG is the same. For the first time, I was surprised. I never knew there was an LPG of MECS. I realized that when I was doing the survey, that they could buy an LPG gas as low as 25 Kenya shillings. That's about $0.25, because they buy them with their pay bills, they use it. Next day, they buy it like that until the cylinder is all used. That is the pay-as-you-go models for 25 shillings up to 300. The MECS accept only up to 300 Kenya shillings per day. As you can see, as the payments increase to higher values, the households that can afford those ones are really few, and that is expected because of the low income of this particular setup. Charcoal is the same case, single small payments whenever they buy them. For ethanol, what I found interesting is that majority, in as much as the households that are buying at very low prices, as little as 25 shillings for the ethanol, but majority prefer to buy them at full canisters. A full canister goes for 189 shillings at the time of doing the survey, and that is about 2.39 liters. And it's a very interesting gas anyway. The slums. Next, please. Next, please. When we did our mathematics to classify the monthly expenditures on fuel, we found out that the range between 1,200 to 1,600 Kenya shillings, majority were falling there. So beyond 1,600, the graph, you see, the graph is rising upwards to a peak, then coming downwards. So we could make assumption that that range of 1,200 to 1,600 is where majority are falling. Beyond there, the monthly expenditures go down. So this was an interesting finding, and we compared this with what we found in Uganda. It was almost the same. They're falling within that range. Beyond 1,600 monthly expenditures, very few households were able to afford this. Next, please. So on assessment of electricity, we developed a model that was actually the person who came up with this infographics. This graphics is called Jess Kesey, who is leading a similar research in Uganda. She's also our counterpart. What it means is that we were looking at households that were genuinely connected to electricity via the meters, and those ones which were not having meters at all. Figure A, for instance, represent a household that is connected to a meter. B represent a household that does not have a meter, but it has electricity. C is a dual connection. They can decide either to use the meter or bypass the meter. D is a situation whereby there's one meter, but it's shared amongst households. And E is a case where there's no meter at all. They drop the line to the house and then spread it to the next, connect it to the next households. And F is a situation whereby they're bypassing the meter. Please go on. Next. So what did you find out with this electricity connection modality? 80% of the residents in Mathare have electricity, but they are not metered. We shall see the implication of this in our four other graphs. Now, 7% were sharing meters. Only 9% were having their own meters, while 4% were using solar systems. When you look at the adjacent graph, on the electricity usage for boiling and cooking, we realize that even though the use of electricity for cooking is still very low, as only about 6% use it for electricity, but when it comes to boiling water, 52% of the households were using it to boil water. So we further interrogated and found out that they were boiling water to transfer to the cooking pots so that they can use less gas or less kerosene or less charcoal or whatever they're using to cook. So it is like electricity is like the starter fuel for cooking in the slum areas. Though they're not using it to cook with the induction cookers, but they're using it to boil water, to transfer the boiled water to the cooking pot. That is why somebody can buy ethanol for 15 shillings and be able to cook for a whole family. So indeed, electricity is playing a very big role in the cooking process. We compared this data with what our counterparts in Uganda are doing, and we found that in Uganda only 22% were using it for boiling water. But what was encouraging from the other side is that the number of households that were illegally connected to electricity were fewer, only 24%, as compared to in our Kenyan scenario, where about 80% actually were using electricity but not connected to meters. Next, please. We also asked them how much they pay for this electricity, and figure A is for households that had meters, their own meters, and you can see monthly cost range from 100 to 3,000. When you compare this to B and C, those who are sharing meters in B, and in C, those ones who did not have meters, you see those who are sharing meters are paying at a very low rate monthly electricity cost, about 200 to 500. Almost the same range with the unmetered households, which were paying as low as 100 to 500. Those were flat rates. So depending on the supplier or whoever is doing the connections, they're paying at different rates. All in all, those houses with meters, which are metered, actually are paying a higher cost. And that can be an impediment, of course, to e-cooking for those who are genuinely connected to the meters. Next, please. Cipros. Next. Yeah, so the meters that we connected to the main sockets and then connecting our induction and then connecting our cookers to the coils to the meters indicated something interesting. This is a 13 days data that we have downloaded from our meters with our energy apps. So figure A was a meter that is installed in the unupgraded section of the slum, while B was installed in the upgraded section of the slum. There's this slum upgrading program that is happening up in the slums, going on in the slum. So when you look at figure A, both figure A and B, there's similarity in the pattern. Different colors represent different days. You will notice that early mornings, that's about 5 a.m. to about 9:30 a.m., there is normally a voltage drop below the 240, the nominal voltage in Kenya is 240. So below the 240 volts, there's a voltage drop in the early mornings and also a voltage drop in the evenings from 5 to about 9:30 p.m. in the evening, there's a voltage drop. Now, these are the peak times when people cook, when people can cook because they're back from work or they're preparing to go to work. But the voltage drop does not support the coils. The households, in fact, told me that if you dare put a coil during those hours, the lighting system goes dim and it brings an outcry in the neighborhoods because some can now not study or do other errands. This leaves us with only two options. Either if you want to comfortably cook, you cook during the midday, but again, they have gone to work, or later at 10 p.m. onwards, which is again is an impediment to this e-cooking because people will be asleep. So A and B shows us the same thing, but B showed us something more interesting, that not interesting, but dangerous, because there were voltage spikes above 240 volts, which can also damage our equipment. It's interesting, I saw in the eCooking app group that the devices that have come up to absorb this issue of voltage surges, spikes, and below the spikes, below the nominal voltage, and that is a good move. But generally, this is what we found out. And it's going to form the basis of our next survey beginning in May on how to, on investigating the causes of these voltage fluctuations. It could be poor connectivity, low quality materials for connections, overloaded systems and stuff. And that is the survey we are planning to do. As I said, this was just a bit, kind of a small survey we are doing. Next, please. This is more general. The initiatives by the government of Kenya to increase access to clean cooking, and the initiatives by the private sector. We recently, the government signed the LPG growth policy, which is interesting because they proposed distribution of subsidized cylinders to low-income households. I hope it will roll out soon. There was also a proposal to for compulsory installation of the LPG reticulation of the infrastructures, and also a promotion of LPG gases in institutions like schools. The government is also partnering with organizations around. They have also signed the bioenergy strategies, and there's also been subsidies and increase of taxes on kerosene. The private sector are also doing well. They have come up with a pay-as-you-go model. They are setting up several ethanol kiosks. Ethanol is available in small quantities, and there's the promotion of use of briquettes, and public awareness on e-cooking through setting up of the e-cooking hubs, which is very fundamental. So in brief, these are the literature we could get about initiatives to increase e-cooking, clean cooking in Kenya. Next, please. For this short survey we did, just to test our instrument and to know how the ground is, I was led by Professor Vijay Modi. Professor is a mechanical engineer based at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. He was the principal investigator and he funded this short survey. There's also Professor June Lukuyu, who is a Kenyan, but based in the US. She's an electrical engineer, works at the University of Washington, and greatly interested in e-cooking research. And we shall engage more beginning summer this year. Next, please. Thank you very much. That's how Mathare looks like. Poor drainage, poor infrastructure, densely populated. It is our cocoa. Yeah, Daimgas. Thank you very much for my short presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Austin, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Anyone who has any questions, kindly post them on the chat. Since we're going to have our second presenter, and then we will do a Q&A at the end. So, Kevin, if you are ready, please. Kevin, is Kevin on the call?
Okay, can you hear me now?
You are a bit low.
Yes,
Maybe try. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now, yeah? Okay, thank you. So the objective of this study was basically to do a market scoping for eCooking in the urban informal settlements in Kenya. So the study was done by Nuvoni Center for Innovation Research, which is an independent research organization that is based in Nairobi. We are currently organized into 3 domains: the energy domain, where this study was done, then the urban development domain, then we have also technology management. So to guide us through the discussion, basically we are going to look at the introduction, what the study was all about, then we look at the results, and then we'll talk about the conclusion and recommendation. So I have to state that we did quite an extensive study, but we are going to present a very high level summary of that study. The study itself is already published under the MECS website. You can access it and have a look at it. So next slide, please. Okay, so basically the focus of this study was to do a market scoping for e-cooking opportunities in the urban informal settlement. When we talk about the urban informal settlement, we targeted 3 informal settlements in Nairobi. That is Kibra, which is the largest informal settlement, Mathare, which is the 2nd largest, and then we have Mukuru, which is also a large informal settlement. So the scoping is supposed to guide the design of the interventions, which are supposed to be geared towards increasing access to and use of e-cooking appliances in the informal settlement. So our target population was basically the households and the food vending businesses. So the task that we were given under the terms of reference was to basically carry out a scoping study, then also do tests of e-cooking. Basically, we adopted the e-cooking diaries as our methodology. Then the last task was to synthesize these findings from these different tasks. So in terms of the scoping, we did a mixed method approach whereby we did the qualitative research method, then we also did the quantitative research method. But I have to state that the qualitative research method was basically employed in Mukuru and Kibra and Mathare also. But then, as you would understand from the challenges in collecting data, you realize that when we are doing the data collection, especially in the informal settlement, it's very difficult to get accurate data from the official statistical sources like the KNBS. Simply, this is normally as a result of the boundaries. The boundaries are designed, and because we wanted to conduct a representative study and we were going to use random sampling, we narrowed in on Mathare because Mathare had a very recent enumeration exercise having been done by SDI. So our approach was basically for Kibra and Mukuru, we did the qualitative, the key informant interviews and the focus group discussions. But for Mathare, because we had that data from SDI, it was possible to do random sampling. And as such, we did a survey in Mathare, which was basically a household survey and also an enterprise survey. Then we also mapped businesses. And when we say businesses in this context, we are talking about the fuel and cook stove vendors. So we mapped them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hello, Citrus. Next slide. So in terms of what we did is basically try to get the description and understand the households that we were dealing with. So what we presented is basically a snapshot of part of the socioeconomic status indicators that we observed. However, in the report, we have the housing, which is predominantly semi-permanent. That is, the roof and the walls are predominantly made of iron sheets. There are very few permanent houses. Then we also have data on the distribution of the household head. And interestingly, the female headed households were about 49%, and the others, the male headed households were about 51%. So there's a bit of an almost equal distribution. But then the reason why we highlighted education and the wealth index. And by the wealth index, we are using the wealth index as developed based on asset ownership and characteristics of the housing that a particular household resides in. So if you look at the ones that we've picked, the socioeconomic status, you realize that the concentration in terms of education is concentrated between primary school and secondary school. So when it comes to the technical training and post-secondary, there are very few households there. Next slide, please. And so the next thing that we did in terms of trying to understand basically the environment around where these households are operating, because our focus is on eCooking, was to look at the systems of electricity that these households have. So we found out that the predominant source of electricity, system of electricity, is basically the grid connection, which is supplied by which is supplied by KPLC. But then an interesting bit is that even though the KPLC connections, that's the grid connection, is the dominant, but it assumes a different form in the sense that there's informal connections and then we have formal connections. By informal connections, what we mean by informal connections, we defined informal connections as any household that is using electricity, but they are not paying that, they're not making the payment to KPLC either directly or indirectly. In fact, what we learned from the household that it has a special name. It's called Mulika in the context of Madari. So they are not paying to KPLC, and these particular households accounted for 86% of the households. So it's only about 14% of the households who are formally connected. If I may draw parallel with what Austin has presented, is what Austin is calling illegal connections, but we went with the term informal connections, basically because our definition was guided by the payment, and then also we were using the multi-tier framework as a guide in the analysis. Next slide, please. So having known the connection, the systems of electricity and the form of connection, we explored to basically understand the usage. So from the data, what we saw is that electricity is predominantly used for lighting, powering electronics, water heating, which also, as Austin has explained, there's an interesting innovation in the sense that households will heat water, then transfer the water to the other cooking usages. But then also interestingly, the cooking in terms of using electricity was about 5.2%, which is slightly higher than if we are to compare with the national average, which we found in the Kenya National eCooking baseline survey. So it's slightly higher in the informal settlement. Now, we connected the use and the cost. And what we found out is that the households that are using informal connections, they're paying about half as much as what the households that are using formal connections are paying. So it's actually cheaper for a household to be informally connected than to be formally connected. And that is a very, that is, we believe that's one of the barriers that could be there in terms of transitioning households to e-cooking. Next slide, please. Having that background, so we used the multi-tier framework to assess the potential for e-cooking. Now, the reason why we adopted the multi-tier framework is because it uses a number of attributes to basically come up with a score that can then give this holistic assessment of the potential for e-cooking. So based on the guidelines of multi-tier framework as developed by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, any household that has a tier 3 and above has the potential to actually transition and its cooking being supported by electricity. So in that case, when we just go by the tiers, I'll just give a little bit of an explanation, an exposition on that. So when it comes to capacity, we are talking about if the household electricity can power e-cooking appliances. And from the guideline, e-cooking appliance that is efficient can be powered by electricity that is scored as tier 3. So based on that, we see that in Mathare, about 70% of households have electricity that can power an e-cooking appliance. Then if you look at the availability, you realize that, as we'll see later, the 4 hours in the evening, which are considered very critical for cooking, there's a very large percentage of households that fall under that, which means from our assessment based on the MTF, that then it means that there's high potential to support e-cooking in Mathare. But then when it comes to reliability, it was interesting to note that 90% of the households actually scored very highly in terms of reliability of the electricity. But then when it comes to the quality of electricity, whereby we are talking about the damage to electrical cooking appliances, about half did not report any damages in the previous 12 months. But then you see that about 47, there were damages to electricity, to cooking appliances. If you go to affordability, you find that at least we scored affordability based on the 5%, that if a household is spending more than 5% of its monthly income on electricity, then they basically are on tier 2. So as you can see, it's about a half. So that one also tells you that in Mathare, most of the households have low income, given that if you look at the predominant form of connection is informal and it's very cheap relative to the formal one, but yet still about half are scored as not having an affordable connection. So we went further and then we tested. We were testing the wiring of the household. So we have the wiring tester that we were plugging into the socket, and then it could tell us how the wiring is done, whether it's properly done, there's a missing earth, or it cannot read at all the assessment of the wiring. So from that particular exercise, we found out that only about 28% had the correct wiring. So this also is a form of concern, especially if we want to transition households to cooking. But then as we apply the MTF, I would like to raise up a few issues, because the MTF, the way it's applied in its original form, we had to do a bit of modification. And as you interpret these figures, you need to know that for households that are informally connected, sometimes the capacity of the electricity is controlled by the vendor. So the person who's vending the electricity to the informal users control how much electricity they can use. Some have circuit breakers. Some basically use instructions, in the sense that a household is told, don't use certain appliances. Now, so I'd like to also say, as we interpret that result, please bear that in mind. So next, we assessed the cooking practices of households. And basically, just as Austin's results show, we also found that the predominant primary cooking solution was actually an LPG stove. Then kerosene was also very popular, followed by the charcoal cook stoves, the improved charcoal cook stoves. Okay, so when it comes to the secondary, because we tested, we surveyed in terms of the three main cooking solutions. But as you can see, something interesting is that most of the households only go up to the second cook stove. Most of them from our survey did not have the third one. But if you look at the dynamics on the secondary cook stove, you find that the kerosene stove is very pronounced, followed by the metallic jiko, which is just the ordinary one, then the improved charcoal stove. So I think these ones also compare very well with Austin's finding. So next slide, please. So the next task that we were involved in is basically to try to understand the cooking practices of the households. So what we did in terms of trying to understand that, we looked at the meals that are commonly prepared in a household. And basically breakfast and supper, those were the common meals that were prepared. If you look at the graph, you see that lunch, not very many households prepare lunch. And then on top of that, we also looked at specific dishes that are prepared. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we have the dishes and the cooking techniques. So basically, we wanted to see whether which are the typical meals that are prepared, which are the typical cooking techniques that households use, so that it could inform our interpretation and insight later. Next slide, please. Now, the other results that we've been focusing on were basically predominantly from the survey. But for us now to understand, have a deeper understanding of the household cooking behavior, we did the cooking diaries, and the results that we are presenting now, we are focusing on the cooking diaries because the cooking diaries, in terms of the richness of the information, they are comparatively better in terms as a methodology, is definitely better than a survey. So based on that, based on the cooking diaries, we actually found out that the cooking behavior was replicated among the cooking diary households and the surveyed households. As you can see, supper and breakfast record the highest frequency, and lunch is still the least in terms of comparison. But interestingly, if you look at the upper graph, which gives us a picture of the baseline, whereby we were basically observing how households are cooking without the introduction of the eCooking appliance, you realize that in terms of food preparation, freshly prepared foods are dominant. This was surprising because, as we know from our own observation and also from visiting the settlement, there's a lot of food vending. So we expected that reheating, our expectation was that reheating would have such a high frequency. But what we see is that freshly prepared food is actually more than the reheating. Then interestingly, when you look at the upper, if you compare the upper and the lower graph, you see that reheating actually goes down in terms of frequency, and freshly prepared food goes up. So basically this one, if we may interpret, given that the introduction of e-cooking appliance, which was basically an EPC, was an intervention. So for the short period that we did, which was 1 month, you see that there's an impact. You can already see there's an impact, that the households are preparing more freshly cooked food after the introduction of the EPC. Next slide, please. So now going deeper into trying to understand this household behavior, we looked at the frequency of preparation. So amongst the households that had the intervention, which is basically the introduction of the EPC. Something that is encouraging is basically, if you look at the left side, tea was initially prepared mostly with an LPG. But then after the introduction of the EPC, you see that tea, the EPC is being used to prepare the tea. Then also ugali, you see that ugali is also doing very well in terms of being prepared in the EPC. Then the beans, the beef is also doing very well. The reason why we look at these results and say that they are positive results based on our own assessment is that basically, if we are to draw comparison with the national study, you realize that the rice and the ugali are the main foods that are being prepared. So the fact that we see that households that were in the cooking diaries can comfortably prepare this food, these particular types of dishes, then it gives us reason to associate that there's a possibility that actually there's a possibility of transition, that there's potential for transition. Next, please. Okay, so this is now the business side of usage. But on the business side of usage, you'll notice that if you look at the left-hand side, which is basically the before, and then you look at the right-hand side, which is the after, you realize that the EPC was not used very much with the businesses. They tended to retain their previous usage, but then from the feedback and the user experience and the exit interview, basically we can associate this pattern to the fact that businesses in the informal settlement of Mathare use multiple cooking points for their clients. Now, another thing that something that came up was that the pots that the APCs that we provided, the pots were smaller. So the businesses favored bigger pots. They wanted bigger pots. And also a constraint was the multiple cooking points. So you don't see the impact on business as pronounced as the impact on households. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So basically, I would like to focus on the right-hand side. But despite the fact that if you look at the business side, it was not used as much. But for the few times that the businesses used the EPC, you realize that for that period, the intervention period, which was which was basically 14 days, the intervention period, there was a reduction in the use of firewood. So even though we don't see much usage, but we can at least extract an impact. Next slide, please. So what do you think that even though the impact on the business side was likely was not as pronounced, we also see that in terms of the expenditures that the businesses record, there was a marginal impact, not actually a marginal impact. If you compare the upper graph, phase 1 and phase 2, there was a reduction. There was a reduction in the expenditure. So which means we take that, we associate that reduction with the intervention that was introduced. Next, please. So in terms of the user experience, what really the households and the businesses pointed out as the benefit for the EPCs, which was our intervention, the intervention that we introduced, was basically the speed of cooking and then the ease of use. But for the ease of use, we'll say that most probably we can say that the ease of use was due to the training that we conducted, because we did a demonstration, a very, very detailed demonstration, which was done by Jikoni Magic. And so the report of the ease of use could be associated with the demonstration. Then the businesses felt that most businesses felt that it was cheap to use, though they were not using it as much. Then the time of cooking, interestingly, the time of cooking did not feature in the business, but it did feature much in the household. Next, please. So having assessed the household side, basically, if we could say the demand side, so we went now to the supply side, then to try to understand the cooking solutions market in Mathare informal settlement. So what we did, first of all, we did a mapping, and then we did an enterprise survey. They were running concurrently. So in some businesses, when some businesses could not allow us to interview them, it was basically because of the timing, because it was just after the finance bill, and most businesses felt like the survey was geared towards informing the government decision to tax businesses. So in such instances, what we basically did was to just take the GPS locations, and then we were able to map them. But from the market side of the study, what we found out is that actually the cooking solutions market is dominated by the fuel vendors. There are more fuel vendors than the cook stove vendors. But then also an interesting thing that I think we need to mention here, which I think you can also get from the report, is that there's also another form of business. I believe we noted in the report. It's called Orodha. I don't know how that one can be explained, but basically that form of business is whereby the business people who are dealing in this business go to collect used and dumped electric appliances, then they bring in the settlement, they repair them, and then they sell them to households. And they sell them at a much cheaper price compared to new ones. So if you look at in terms of the fuel, if we focus on the fuel, because the market is dominated by the fuel, the kerosene vendors are more. And we believe that this could be associated with the fact that for kerosene, it can easily be accessed through the petrol stations, and then it can be bought in small quantities then for onward reselling. Then the LPG is also a dominant form of fuel business, and charcoal and firewood. Now for the LPG, what from the interviews, the businesses did indicate that sometimes they get these LPGs on credit, then they sell, then they pay later. Then the charcoal, as Austin also noted, we were also informed by the businesses that the charcoal can be sold even in small bags of 20 shillings. So which means that smaller quantities can be sold based on that. So next slide, please. We went ahead to look at the demand drivers, but based on the business side of the market, basically the vendors. So what they identified as a main driver is basically the cost, the cost of the product that is being sold. So cost has a significant influence on how much sales and the revenue of the business. Then availability was also rated very highly. Next, please. Now, on the business side, we also sought to understand what are the challenges that are in that particular market. And one thing that
Hello, Kevin.
Hello?
Oh, sorry. Please try to start wrapping up.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
So the main challenge there was basically the cost of capital, the source of capital, and then the cost of financing. So if you look at on the right-hand side, you realize that most businesses, their source of capital is their own funding. Then if you look at the income in the informal settlement is basically casual employment and small businesses. So that is a real challenge. Next slide, please. So we sought also to understand what would be the best strategy for entry into the market in the informal settlement. And basically what came out was that targeted marketing was favored by most businesses as the most effective, followed by affordability and then the demonstration. Next slide, please. So having known that, we tried to find out what would be the best way of creating awareness. And then we actually, from the responses, the family and friends came up top, the traditional media. And an interesting thing that we need to point out that also came out was the social media, but in terms of the WhatsApp groups. There are some WhatsApp groups that are formed basically for the marketing purposes. Next slide, please. So basically, from what we studied, our conclusions were basically, this is a high-level summary of the conclusion. There's a detailed outline on the conclusion in the report. So the economic factors in terms of the household income and pricing are very critical if we are to accelerate e-cooking in the informal settlement. The economic factors, especially income and pricing, you realize that they affect the formality of household connection. They affect the fuel that households are purchasing. And then if you go to electricity, from our analysis, you find that the informal connections are paying about a half what the formal connections are paying. So in terms of that, maybe if we are to introduce e-cooking, the billing for the informal settlement, I think, should also be considered. Then stacking, something that came out is that stacking was predominantly a very simple stack. First, secondary, majority of them are there, which means that households, once they have a reliable stack, then they're most likely to use that. The next was the e-cooking compatibility in terms of the foods being prepared and the techniques being used. E-cooking is very compatible with what's going on in terms of the cooking practices in the informal settlement. So there's potential there for a transition. Then the businesses, as we noted earlier, you'll see that the effect on the businesses, the impact of the intervention was not as much, but mostly it was because businesses use multiple cooking points. And then also the pot sizes, they found the pot sizes being smaller. And then also what we noted from the market structure of the informal settlement as far as the cooking solutions are concerned is that basically the concentration is on cooking fuel. So most of the businesses are in cooking fuel. So if you come and transition the businesses to e-cooking, there's going to be a disruptive effect in the market because now you'll displace the fuel vendors. But then also, if you look at it on the other side, we have opportunities for cook stove sellers to also tap into that market. Then the other market also gives an opportunity whereby a player who wants to get into that market can partner with them, then they can provide the after-sale service, especially repairs. So basically, that is a very high-level summary. There's a detailed report on the MECS website. I would encourage everyone to look at it. And in case of any questions, we are open to discussion. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Austin, for very informative and useful presentations. My name is Leonard Nongesa. I did not introduce myself at the beginning. The next session is the question. If we have any questions, I have been compiling the questions in the chat section. For those who did not write down the questions, if we have time, we'll still have an opportunity to raise your questions. So let me go through the questions in the chat section first. First, I think we got with Austin, the first presenter. John Larry asked a question: if you are able to find any households that are using energy storage charged from the grid or solar to mitigate the voltage dips in the evening peak. Austin?
Sorry, please. In a brief, there was some small interruption.
Okay. Maybe I can just load the Cyprian, am I allowed to share? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
please. If you can share,
okay.
if you can share
okay. Fine. It will be faster that way. Now, okay. As I'm preparing to share the questions on the screen, maybe any other person can raise the question.
Well, let's see this. Let me check the charts then. Oh. Are you trying to project?
Yes, I'm trying to project. Okay.
Find any houses?
Are we seeing the screen?
Yes. Did you find any houses in energy storage? Okay, I can see the question from John. Apparently, no, I didn't find any storage to mitigate the voltage dips. They just accept it how it is, and they avoid cooking during that time until maybe after 10 p.m. when the voltage is a bit stable. I see Professor Matthew Leach.
Yes, yeah, he will want to you to elaborate a bit more about unmetered connections.
At some legal. Okay, fine. This is a common practice in the informal settlement. What unmetered means is that you'll find an experienced technician tapping direct from a transformer to one household, and then it connects with a wire to the next household, to the number to so many households, just using a very small wire. So what happens in that case is that the main provider, the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, is not aware that they have some customers, in quotes, who are using their electricity, but paying an electrician somewhere who is not even in their database. They don't even know it. So those are the people we are calling the illegal. They're not connected at all. So they're consuming what can't be accounted for by the KPLC. Now, what I found out is that it depends on the electrician who is connecting you to that system, because some will charge 500, some 300 flat rate, depending whether you use it till morning or whatever. You pay only 300 per month. Some, but maximum was 500. It's a flat rate for the legal connections. So if you're lucky enough, you get the 300 one. If you're unlucky, you get the 500 one. Danson is saying, just wondering if you use of coils. All right. So yes, they use the coils. What slum dwellers use are some spiral coils. It's a foreign spiral coils that are made by some artisans locally there. I didn't find any household who is using a rice cooker or even an EPC. But when I asked them about them, they were really willing to use those more better equipments like EPCs and rice cookers, because they were saying the coils that they're using often explode and cause fire breakouts. Actually, some landlords are discouraging the use of those coils in their businesses, in their premises. I think I had only 3 questions. The rest are for Kelvin. See, yeah.
Yes. Now I think we can go to Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Kevin, someone Victory.
Okay.
Wants to know when you say 86% of the households are not paying KPLC directly or indirectly. What do you mean? I know.
Okay.
I know. For us, the Kenyans, we understand what it means.
Okay, so basically the informal connections, if I may call it market, the informal connections market, it's surprisingly very well organized with suppliers. So we have individuals, as Austin has said, we have individuals who tap electricity from the main lines of Kenya Power. So they act as the distributors. So they're in between KPLC and the households. So they're the ones who get these payments. So the payment does not go to KPLC, but goes to these individuals. And actually, to just give a bit of context on it, it's called Mulika because it was being tapped from another source that was a public source for lighting. So these individuals are able to tap this power, then distribute. So because they are like the middlemen between KPLC and the household, but only that they are not remitting these payments to KPLC. And our estimate on 86% is based on a random sampling. So we believe it's reflective of the settlement. Hope answered that.
Okay, from Nyokabi, are there arrangements in the informal settlement for bulk power purchase from KPLC?
Okay, from the study, we did not come across such an arrangement because basically, as Austin was calling it, illegal, it is just an individual takes that initiative to tap the power. So I could be right or wrong, but I don't believe KPLC has the knowledge of these exact individuals, because interestingly, you could find that some households even have 2 or 3 suppliers of the same power, and they keep switching. So there's also a bit of volatility between the supplies. So if this line is not working, the household simply switch to another line. So there's no, from our interviews and the surveys, there's no such arrangement. Yeah.
Okay, a question from John that you mentioned about induction stoves. as a more efficient and alternative to the spiral hot plates in common use in my Yamadari.
Okay, I believe that
Yes.
should be to
Yes, it will
be Austin, because for us the intervention that we introduced was an EPC, and basically what we saw is that in terms of the energy efficiency, the EPC was much better compared to the dominant one, which was the LPG.
Okay, he says that it could be interesting to carry out a series of CCTs with these different appliances at different supply voltage to some real data on this.
Okay.
Okay. Then from Matthew, are you able to explain how people have cost for informal use of electricity? Who are they paying?
So as I've explained before, it's basically they're just paying to individuals, and the pricing mechanism, as Austin has also alluded to, it's basically a fixed price kind of mechanism whereby a household, the supplier and the household will negotiate, but there's variation. But we also found that it's about between 300 and up to around 6-7 there. But it's a negotiated fixed rate kind of pricing. And then they basically pay these individuals. Yeah. That is how we saw the market, the market operating. Yeah. Okay. Then to respond to the question by George, basically what we found out in terms of safety, and we were using the MTF guideline to assess safety, was that in terms of the safety, what we found out in Mathare was about 17% of cases of injuries in the previous 12 months. So if you look at that particular prevalence, is a bit high compared to what we found in the national survey, because in the national survey it was less than 10%. So basically, given the kind of wiring, and we also did the wiring, and we only found that 28% of the households have the proper wiring, then that 17% is very high, because remember we're talking about 17% of about 250,000 households based on our estimates on our weighted sample. So that is a lot of households within a period of 12 months. Yeah, so there's an issue with the safety. And then also, if you look at the report, you find that most of the people who are doing the wiring, they don't have qualification. So we have instances of just you do it yourself, someone just does their wiring, and we have other people who are unqualified, but they are just known for doing the wiring. So the unqualified technicians, in the sense that they are not certified, and then the do it yourself is also very prevalent. So, and then that, if we look at that and then we look at the cases, you can see an association there. Yeah.
Okay, and lastly, the tests that you did with the businesses. What size of EPCs were you using?
The smaller, the 6-8 liter one, around that range, not the 20 liter one. It was this smaller ones of 6 liters.
Okay, I think I have exhausted the questions in the chat section. If we have anyone who still have any concern or a question to raise, please take this opportunity. Okay, yes, John. I can see, John, your hand is raised up, but then you are mute.
No, we can't hear you, John.
Okay, as
Pauline?
Pauline?
Yeah, Pauline is, okay, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Pauline, please go ahead.
Okay, mine is just a comment, especially from those illegal, very high number of illegal connections. And it seems like people are accessing this electricity even without having it legal. So I think it's just a suggestion to Kenya Power to be more people friendly and giving them the legal connections in a more friendly manner so that they can use it and maybe be more safer, because already they are accessing the electricity. They are not paying to Kenya Power. Maybe these are the bills this is what drives the bills for everyone else. So it's just a thought that if we can look at it from a positive side of it, that these are customers who can be helped, and if they are given a legal and easier way, they could pay and maybe be more safe, and the bills would come down. It's my comment and my observation.
Okay, thank you for your observation, Pauline. Let's go to Verena.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the very interesting and insightful presentations. I received already some part of the answer from Maurice, so thanks, Maurice. I wanted to understand like either the psychology or the economics behind this choice that people make to prefer informal connections over formal. So has it to do with also their informal settlement, let's say overall informality? Has it to do with KPLC requesting certain requesting too much, let's say, for them? Because from the presentation I understood the electricity from the private, households retailing electricity is much more expensive than from Kenya Power. So it has probably to do with, I don't know, registration and other requirements from KPLC. Maybe you can give some insights there.
Maybe if I could respond. Leonard, could I respond?
Okay, Kevin, please.
Okay, so basically to respond first, a correction. The electricity from the informal connection is cheaper. Actually, about half from the survey, it's about half what the formally connected households are paying. So it's cheap for the household. But our analysis of the data also points to basically the pricing. because if you are to look at the prices that they are paying, which is about half the formal, then you tie it to the employment. In the report, we highlight the labor market in the informal settlement. You find that about 70% work within the informal settlement, and they are doing casual jobs and these small businesses. Now, we did look at other reports. We did look at a report by the UN Habitat. We also looked at a report by the Slum Dwellers International. They also came around that estimate, but for slum dwellers, I think it was around 65. So you find that most of the households, if you look at their sources of income, they are very low sources of income. So initially, we can just do an associative analysis. Of course, the coastal analysis will require more in-depth analysis, but by just associative analysis, you see that it's mostly the economic factors, which I highlighted in the conclusion, being the income and the pricing. So because a rational household would go for a cheaper electricity connection compared to an expensive one. So economically speaking, you would expect that as a rational reaction to the pricing if a household knows that it can access cheaper power. So from our analysis, we believe it's more of an economic issue on pricing and income.
Okay. So I see we have only 7 minutes remaining and we need to wrap up with the way forward. But if we still have more other questions, I will advise that we can request the emails from the presenters. Then we can, escalate the questions to them, and we know we still get the feedback. Maybe I'll a chance to John.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't be heard earlier. Can you hear me now?
Yes, John.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to ask about this kind of process of formalization of these informal middlemen or cartels that are reselling electricity that they're tapping from Kenya Power, and whether these pilots that are going on in specific areas of informal settlements across the country could provide an entry point for engaging with these resellers through the goal of demand stimulation, the shared goal of demand stimulation, because currently having a fixed rate for electricity means that it doesn't matter for them how much their customers are using, they just get the same fee no matter what. But under this new arrangement, then households are metered and they get a cut of every unit that is sold. So just like Kenya Power wants to stimulate demand through the Kenya Power program, because they make more revenue, these middlemen would then make more money if they stimulated demand amongst their customers. So I wanted to ask Kevin and the Nivoni team, I see Elsie has already commented a bit on the chat, but I just wanted to ask an open question as to how feasible you think this is as a potential entry point, working with these now slightly more formalized middlemen as partners on demand stimulation through electric cooking, perhaps through supplying appliances, for example, and providing after-sales service for appliances sold in the local area where they're reselling electricity.
Okay, so maybe I'll let Elsie answer that, because I think Elsie, you're very well versed with the political economy, which in my view would address that better. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, John. Yeah, indeed, you've answered part of it, that if they're charging a flat rate, they don't care if you're using more or less power. Often the case is that they come in, look at your household, look at how many appliances you have, what you're doing, and say, okay, we'll charge you 300 shillings a month, or we'll charge you 500 shillings a month. Then you negotiate with them and find a happy middle, and that's what you keep paying going forward. And if the reseller changes, then you have to keep having these negotiations at the household level. So this is quite common in terms of pricing. I saw someone was asking a question about the pricing model. So it's quite informal and ad hoc and case-to-case basis. But I know also households, it's like the settlement is split. There are some households who want metered connections because they believe they want to pay for formal power, legal power. They want to moderate how much power they use at the household level. They want control. But then there are those households that are happy to continue paying 300 shillings a month. The Kenyans in the room know that that's fairly cheap. Very few households in an urban environment who have TVs and iron boxes and instant showers are paying 300 shillings a month. So moving to a metered connection means paying more. And households are resisting this. There are some households that are resisting this. So it might be interesting to see how this collaboration between Kenya Power and local electricity resellers may evolve in that regard, if it might be possible to actually set up a metered approach and whether that will be set at market prices. I think that's an ongoing conversation, which of course then complicates this demand stimulation question as to whether then households would be willing to spend more to cook with electricity, given that they're used to paying fairly low rates.
Okay, thank you for that, Elsie. And I think we can take a few minutes just to wrap up. And you know, looking at the two presentations, we realize that there are a lot of you know, critical insights that we need to take action. The presentation from Austin in understanding the monthly energy expenditure, where the majority of the households are spending between 1,200 to 1,600 is a very informative insight that I'm very sure it can inform financial modeling when deploying clean cooking solutions, and to be specific, the eCooking technology, and also the types of, you know, the types of the cooking technologies that are being used. You could see the graph that clean cooking solutions are being used more, and there is some quite improvements as compared to the previous researches that has been done before. Could say majority using LPG, electric cooking, you know, gaining momentum, ethanol gaining momentum, and given that majority of the households in these informal settlements are also still using, they're using kerosene for cooking. This means that there is quite a big opportunity to deploy electric cooking solutions or any other clean cooking solution. And another important insight from Kevin with the businesses. I think now we know the hiccups that we know we need to unlock, so that we can have all these businesses relying on eCooking for for their cooking. And so quite some recommendations were made by the two presenters, of which I understand that some of the things that have been commented are already being done by different partners in this sector, but also there are those that needs quick action and also partnerships to take place. So maybe if we have any direction, maybe from John, on which what next after this.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. So yeah, I think it's an exciting area and one of the often overlooked areas where electric cooking can make a significant impact, obviously with many challenges that have been highlighted throughout the session today. But I think we have identified some entry points, and I know there is an ongoing conversation with Leonard, your team, Energy for Impact, and the SMB team as well, about how we can start turning these findings into action. How can we start exploring some of these opportunities and figuring out how can we simultaneously increase access to clean cooking, increase demand generation for Kenya Power, and increase the safety of connections. How can we combine these things in holistic interventions that take into account this very complex political economy dimension that is present in informal settlements? So we have conversations happening later this week, and we look forward to taking this conversation forward. So it's not just conversations, it is action, and we can really figure out how we can work together to take some of these ideas off the drawing board. So I want to say a big thank you to both the Navoni and Austin and his team for really sharing these really important findings and diving deep into these complex contexts, and to Cypros and to Leonard for convening us today. This has been a really exciting discussion, and I think it's actually the best attended COP dialogue so far. So well done, everyone, and thank you. It's really great to see this deep engagement, and I hope that going forward we can turn these conversations into action. Back to you, Leonard.
Okay, thank you, John. I think we are done, but I hand over the microphone to Cypros, my co-host.
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. Thank you, John. And thank you to our presenters today. That was a very wonderful session. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We look forward to having you in another session next month. I think actually, yeah, from tomorrow, it's the next month. So looking forward to having you again. We will keep having these engagements. So we are grateful for you taking time and joining us, and we hope that you've been able to learn something. Thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon.